The chill of winter had descended upon the small European town, creeping into every crack and crevice of its narrow streets and humble homes. The sky, once a vibrant blue that seemed to stretch endlessly above, was now a cold, oppressive gray. A constant, biting wind swept through the streets, carrying with it the sharp sting of snowflakes that seemed to pierce the skin. It was as if nature itself had decided to turn against the people of this town, as if the weather, like the war that had already ravaged their lives, was a force beyond their control. The once thriving community, full of laughter, music, and warmth, now felt hollow, reduced to a shadow of what it had once been. The buildings, once proud and sturdy, stood now as weathered reminders of better times, windows boarded up, doors reinforced, their facades chipped and cracked by the relentless passage of time and conflict. Within these homes, families huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed close against each other to stave off the cold that seemed to seep into their bones. The warmth of a fire, once a comforting luxury, was now a rare and cherished resource, reserved for the most dire of nights. The hearth, a symbol of domestic security, had become a battleground itself, scarcity making it nearly impossible to keep a fire burning for more than a few hours. The lack of fuel, the scarcity of food, the absence of joy, everything had been consumed by the war, which stretched on endlessly, with no end in sight. It felt as if the people of this town had already been forgotten by the world, their suffering relegated to the farthest corners of the map, where no one seemed to care. They had endured countless hardships, rationing, fear, hunger, but it was the cold that truly began to break them. It was as if the war had been a series of escalating horrors, each one preparing them for the next, but nothing could have prepared them for this. Nothing could have prepared them for the brutal grip of winter. The people had learned to adapt. They had learned to endure. But the cold, this silent, unyielding enemy, was something that broke even the most stoic of spirits. Children who had once played in the streets, their laughter ringing through the air, now huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, their small hands stiff from the cold. The elderly, who had once been the keepers of wisdom and tradition, now seemed fragile, their bones aching from the bitter winds that cut through their thin layers of clothing. The town, once full of life, now seemed a place of shadows, a place where hope had been buried under the weight of the snow and the silence that had fallen over everything. The once bustling markets were now eerily empty, the stalls abandoned, their wares frozen and left to wither. It was as if time itself had stopped in this place, as if everything had become suspended in a cold, timeless void. For those who remained, there was no escape from the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to envelop the town. There was no place to hide from the cold, no refuge from the constant gnawing hunger, no sanctuary from the fear that lingered in every corner. The occupiers, once a distant presence, now seemed omnipresent, their soldiers patrolling the streets, their eyes watchful and cold. The war had not only taken away their freedom but had also stolen the very essence of their lives. Every day felt like a new struggle, a new test of endurance, a new trial to survive. The people were not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting the elements, fighting to stay alive, fighting to retain some semblance of their dignity in a world that had been stripped bare. Yet, in the midst of this despair, the most haunting aspect of their plight was the sense of waiting, the sense of being caught in a moment of suspended animation. The families had long since ceased to ask how long the war would last. They no longer dared to dream of a world beyond the war. Instead, they waited for something else, something that, in their hearts, they knew would come, but feared more than anything else. They waited for judgment. The cold, indifferent judgment of fate that would determine whether they would live or die, whether they would survive this brutal winter or be claimed by it. They had witnessed enough death to understand that war did not offer any guarantees. The judgment of war was a cruel and arbitrary thing, with no mercy for those caught in its path. This judgment had already begun to shape the lives of the families. The elderly had been abandoned, left to die alone in their homes, their frail bodies too weak to endure the cold. The children, too young to fully comprehend the horrors of war, were nonetheless marked by it, by the hollow eyes of their parents, by the fear that was now a constant companion. And the parents themselves, once proud and strong, had become shadows of their former selves, their spirits broken by the weight of survival. They had once been the backbone of their community, the ones who had built the homes, the businesses, the institutions that had defined their town. Now, they were reduced to mere survivors, fighting not for prosperity, but for the very right to exist. Each day felt like a battle against the elements, against the enemy, against their own despair. The hunger that gnawed at their insides was not just physical, it was psychological. It was the hunger for hope, for relief, for something, anything, that might end their suffering. The long nights seemed endless, the days blurred together in a haze of cold and exhaustion. The once familiar rhythm of life had been replaced by a strange, nightmarish routine of waiting and wondering. Each family had their own way of coping with this endless wait. Some tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, gathering together for quiet meals, for stories passed down from generation to generation. Others had lost all sense of time, their lives governed by the cycle of hunger and exhaustion, the moments of warmth when a fire could be kindled, and the long, lonely hours when it would inevitably die out. The children, for their part, still clung to the vestiges of childhood. They played as best as they could in the snow, their laughter thin and fragile, like a fleeting glimpse of something long lost. But even their games were not immune to the weight of the world around them. They played soldiers and survivors, enacting the scenes they had witnessed in the streets, mimicking the soldiers who had come to occupy their town. It was as if, even in their innocent play, they had come to understand the brutality of the world they had been thrust into. There was no escaping the reality of war, no way to shield their minds from the horrors that surrounded them. And yet, in their games, there was a glimmer of something that the adults had lost. A resilience, a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. As the families continued to wait, the war seemed to stretch on without end. It had become a permanent fixture in their lives, an oppressive presence that no one could escape. They had learned to survive it, to adapt, to endure. But in doing so, they had lost something precious, something that could never be replaced. The war had taken not just their homes, their food, their loved ones, but their very sense of self. It had transformed them into something else, something that could no longer be defined by the lives they had once known. The cold had done its work. It had stripped them bare, leaving them exposed to the elements, to the judgment of the world, and to the unspoken truth that no one was truly safe from the ravages of war. And yet, despite it all, they waited. They waited for judgment, and they waited for the moment when something, anything, might come to change their fate. What they did not know was that the very thing they had been waiting for was already on its way, though they could not have imagined the form it would take. The town had settled into an eerie silence, a kind of solemn resignation that seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. It was as if the very walls of the houses had absorbed the despair of their inhabitants, and the streets had become a silent witness to the collective suffering of a people who no longer had the luxury of hope. The cold had settled in deep, creeping into the bones of the town and its people, making every movement feel like an effort, every breath like a battle. The families who remained in this forsaken place no longer spoke of the future, for it had become an abstract concept, a distant thought that had little relevance in a world consumed by survival. They had long abandoned the idea that anything could change, that the war would end, or that some miracle would deliver them from the grip of their occupiers. The war, like the winter, had become an unyielding force of nature, something to endure, but never to escape. The streets, once bustling with the activity of daily life, now appeared almost lifeless. The market square, which had once been filled with the sounds of vendors hawking their goods, had become a desolate place, its cobblestones covered in a thin layer of snow, untouched and unmoved. The stalls, once vibrant with colors and smells, now stood abandoned, their owners nowhere to be seen, or perhaps too afraid to venture out into the open. The sounds of footsteps, once familiar and comforting, now echoed hollowly as people made their way through the streets, their heads bowed against the wind. Even the sound of children playing, which had once brought a sense of life and energy to the town, had become rare. The children were quieter now, their laughter not as frequent as it had once been, replaced by the distant hum of mothers trying to keep their families warm and fed, or by the crackling of fires that barely seemed to have the strength to burn. The town had become a place of survival, not of living. The struggle to keep warm, to find enough food to eat, and to protect oneself from the cold had replaced every other thought. Even the most basic comforts had become luxuries. The warmth of a fire, once a constant companion in the homes of these people, had become a precious commodity, something to be rationed, something to be guarded closely. But even that was not enough to push back the cold. The fires would burn for a few hours, offering some semblance of relief, but soon they would flicker and die, leaving behind only the chill that had begun to permeate every corner of the town. There were no longer enough resources to sustain them all. The people had learned to adapt, to live with less, but even their resilience was being tested by the cruelty of the elements. Inside the homes, life continued, but in a muted, half-hearted way. The families had become masters of making do, creating routines out of scarcity. Mothers would try to bake whatever meager flour they could scrape together into bread, while fathers, if they were still alive, would venture out in search of firewood or any other supplies they could find. Children, understanding more than they should, learned to keep quiet, to save whatever warmth their bodies could offer to those they loved. The houses themselves seemed to reflect this quiet struggle, once cozy and filled with laughter, now cold and dark, their windows shut tight to keep out the frigid air. There was no longer any joy in these homes, no longer any sense of community or togetherness. The families, though bound by love and necessity, had become isolated from one another, as if the weight of the war and the cold had driven a wedge between them. The elders, once the stewards of wisdom and history, had begun to fade. Their once strong voices, filled with stories of the past, had become soft, their bodies fragile, unable to withstand the constant toll of the harsh winter. Some had died quietly in their sleep, their passing unnoticed by the rest of the world, while others lingered on, their frailty a stark reminder of the cost of survival. The elderly had been the first to feel the full brunt of the cold, their bodies too weak to fight off its relentless assault. They were the ones who had lived through the First War, who had seen their own families torn apart, but now they found themselves unable to protect their children, unable to shield them from the horrors of this second, even more devastating war. The passing of the elders, though quiet and unnoticed, marked the end of an era. They were the last vestiges of a time before the war, before the suffering, and their absence only deepened the sorrow that clung to the town like a second skin. Despite the heaviness that had descended upon them, the people of the town had learned to live in the shadows. They had learned to adapt to the quiet cruelty of their existence. There was no longer any room for protest or rebellion, for those who dared to speak out had been silenced long ago. The occupiers, cold and unfeeling, had long since taken over the town, and there was no hope of resistance. The people had learned to live with their fear, to accept it as part of their daily lives. The soldiers patrolled the streets, their eyes vigilant, their weapons always within reach, their presence a constant reminder that the people of the town were not free. The occupiers did not need to do much to maintain control. They only had to remind the people of their power, to show them that resistance was futile. The soldiers were always watching, always listening, always ready to quash any flicker of defiance. And so, the people learned to keep their heads down, to stay out of the soldiers' way, to exist quietly, as if invisible to the world around them. It was in this silence, this suffocating quiet, that the people of the town had begun to change. They had become shadows of themselves, no longer sure of who they were or what they stood for. The war had stripped them of their identity, of their dignity, of their sense of self. They had become survivors, not people, not individuals, but mere echoes of who they had once been. They had learned to live without hope, to live in a world where the future was a cruel illusion. They could not look to the past for answers, for the past had been destroyed by the very war that had ravaged their lives. The present was all they had, and even that was fading away, piece by piece. It was in this cold, brutal reality that they continued to exist, holding on to whatever they could, memories, scraps of food, a moment of warmth here and there, just to make it through another day. But even in this darkness, there was a flicker of something, a small, almost imperceptible spark of life. It was in the eyes of the children, who still found ways to play, to imagine, to dream. It was in the quiet exchanges between neighbors, who still shared what little they had, even if it was only a piece of bread or a warm drink. It was in the mothers who, despite their exhaustion, continued to care for their children, to offer them whatever comfort they could. And it was in the fathers who ventured out into the cold to find firewood, to gather whatever they could to keep their families warm. Even in the midst of this suffering, there was still a sense of humanity, still a sense of connection, however fragile it might have been. They did not know it, but something was beginning to shift. The world beyond their town had not forgotten them, and the winds of change were slowly beginning to blow in their direction. The cold, harsh winter would not last forever, and the judgment they had been waiting for, the judgment of fate, was not going to be what they expected. It would not come from the occupiers, nor from the forces of war. It would come from somewhere else entirely, from a source they could not have anticipated. And in the end, it would change everything. The first sound was the hum of engines in the distance. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible over the howling wind and the muffled silence that had become the town's constant companion. But then, like an echo rising in a cavern, it grew louder, clearer, and unmistakable. It was the sound of vehicles moving slowly, deliberately, through the streets, their engines reverberating through the cold air. At first, the people of the town had no reason to believe that this was anything other than another part of the relentless machinery of war. In fact, they almost dared not hope that it might be something else. The presence of soldiers, the rumble of military convoys, had become an accepted part of their daily lives, a constant reminder of the power that the occupiers held over them. They had learned to expect nothing but more of the same: the cold, the hunger, the oppression, and even when something new approached, they braced themselves for the worst. After all, what else could they expect in a world where cruelty had replaced compassion, where power had replaced justice? But as the hum of the engines grew louder, a strange tension filled the air. The usual fear that accompanied the arrival of soldiers had faded into a curious apprehension. Something about the sound was different this time. It was not the harsh, mechanized rumble of military vehicles. It was smoother, more deliberate, as though the wheels were turning for a purpose that had nothing to do with the usual mandates of occupation. There was something almost gentle in it, an incongruity in the rhythm of the engines that caused people to pause, to look up from their windows, to step out of their homes for the first time in days. The wind howled, but it seemed to be stilled for a moment, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the answer to an unspoken question. And then they saw them, vehicles, but not the armored tanks or jeeps they had come to expect. These were trucks, but unlike any trucks they had seen before. They were not the vehicles of war, but of something else entirely. Painted in muted greens and grays, their sides marked with unfamiliar insignia, they were large, lumbering, and full of a strange promise that sent ripples of unease through the gathered crowd. The vehicles moved slowly, cautiously, as if aware of the weight of their arrival. And as they rolled into the town, the air seemed to grow warmer, as if the cold had momentarily lifted, just enough to make people believe in something else, a brief flicker of warmth amidst the encroaching chill. The trucks stopped in the middle of the square, their engines idling for a moment before the doors opened. The sight that followed was something the people of the town had not expected, not in their wildest dreams. Soldiers, yes, but not the soldiers they had come to know. These soldiers wore different uniforms, not the dark, imposing garb of their occupiers, but the lighter, more practical clothing of a foreign army. Their faces were not cold, but warm, their eyes not hard, but soft with something approaching kindness. They did not march into the town with the authority of conquerors, but with the cautious steps of those who were unsure of what they would find. There were no guns held at the ready, no stern commands to silence the crowd. Instead, the soldiers carried something else, something unexpected: large, warm bundles of fabric. At first, the people of the town could only stare in disbelief. The soldiers, moving in a coordinated and organized manner, began to unload the bundles from the back of the trucks, their movements deliberate and purposeful. They laid the bundles out on the ground, and as the fabric unrolled, it became clear what they were. Coats. Thick, warm coats, designed to withstand the harshest of winters. The sight of them, at first so simple, so humble, was enough to stop the people in their tracks. For a moment, the town seemed to forget the cold, forget the war, forget the suffering. All that mattered, all that could be seen was the unmistakable promise of warmth, something so simple, yet so incredibly rare in their world. It was an odd thing to see soldiers distributing such an everyday item. The people of the town had long since forgotten what it was like to receive anything without having to fight for it. Every morsel of food, every scrap of comfort had been earned through struggle, and yet here were these soldiers, laying out these bundles of warmth, offering them freely. For the families who had already begun to lose hope, who had been reduced to mere survivors in the face of an overwhelming enemy, this gesture was not just an act of generosity, it was an act of defiance, a quiet, subtle revolution that shook the very foundation of their world. At first, there was hesitation. The people, still caught in the grip of disbelief, lingered at the edges of the square, unsure of what to do. They had been taught to fear the occupiers, to never trust a stranger, to never believe that kindness could come from those who had once been their oppressors. But something about the soldiers' actions, their careful movements, their lack of arrogance, their unspoken respect, began to soften the hard, frozen shells of the people's hearts. The warmth of the coats, tangible and real, seemed to pierce through the layers of doubt and fear that had built up over the years. Slowly, cautiously, the families began to approach. First one, then another, then more. Their movements were tentative, like animals approaching a new source of food, unsure if it was a trap or a gift. But as each family member stepped forward, they were met with a kind word, a hand extended, a warm smile. There was no force, no pressure, only an invitation to share in this rare moment of humanity. As the coats were distributed, a strange transformation began to take place. The town, which had once been cold, detached, and broken, began to stir. For the first time in what seemed like forever, the people began to talk to one another. They exchanged glances, smiles, and whispers, as if this small act of kindness had somehow unlocked something deep within them, something they had long since forgotten. The soldiers, who had been so foreign just moments ago, now seemed like part of the town, like they belonged in a way that no one had expected. The coats were not just physical warmth, but emotional warmth, an unspoken bond that began to heal the deep, painful rift that had formed between the people and the world around them. As the distribution continued, something else began to shift. The children, who had watched in silence up until now, began to move more freely, their faces lighting up with wonder and excitement. They, too, had felt the cold, the endless biting cold that had stolen away their childhood. But now, they had something to cling to, a small, simple piece of joy amidst the chaos of their lives. The sight of children laughing, their breath visible in the cold air, their hands clutching the coats with a mix of reverence and wonder, was a sight that no one had dared to hope for. It was a brief, fleeting moment of innocence in a world that had been stripped of it, and for those few seconds, the war seemed a distant memory, as distant as the warm days of their past lives. The soldiers, too, were affected by the experience. They were not indifferent to the change they had wrought in this small town. The gratitude in the eyes of the families, the quiet dignity with which they accepted the coats, was enough to make them pause, to make them wonder about the world they were fighting for. They, too, had been touched by something that went beyond the mere act of charity. It was an acknowledgement that, despite everything, there was still humanity left in this war-torn world. For the soldiers, it was a moment of redemption, of finding a way to make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. They were not conquerors. They were simply people, doing what they could to help others in a world that seemed to have lost its way. The coats, warm and soft against the cold, became a symbol of something more than just protection from the elements. They became a symbol of kindness, of humanity, of the unexpected power of compassion in a world that had been consumed by violence. And for the families of the town, they represented something far greater than warmth. They represented a glimmer of hope, a fleeting moment of peace amidst the chaos. It was a small act, but it had the power to change everything. As the days passed, the warmth from the coats did not fade. It lingered in the hearts of the people, lingering far longer than the fabric could possibly hold. What had initially appeared to be a simple gift had transformed into something more profound. It was not merely the physical warmth that the coats provided, it was the sense of humanity they had rekindled. The cold, harsh grip of winter still held the town tightly in its grasp, but now, in small moments, the people felt that they had been given something beyond survival. They had been given something that defied the cruelty of the world they had been living in, a reminder that, even in the darkest hours, kindness could still find its way through. The very act of receiving those coats had cracked open a door that many had long since closed off, a door that led to something that had been buried beneath years of hardship, the possibility of something better. But the coats, like all gifts, were more complicated than they first appeared. At first, it had been easy to simply accept the warmth they offered, to let it wrap them in a sense of comfort and relief. But as the days went on, a quiet unease began to take root. The people could not ignore the reality of their situation. The coats were not going to change everything. They could not bring back the dead, they could not fill their stomachs or heal their wounds, and they could not make the war end. There was still the constant threat of soldiers patrolling the streets, the looming presence of the occupiers who had imposed their will on the town. The coats were a kindness, yes, but they were not the answer to the deeper questions that had been gnawing at the people for so long. Could kindness truly change the course of a war? Could it undo the suffering that had been inflicted over years of occupation, years of fear, hunger, and loss? The families who had received the coats began to feel this unease in different ways. Some struggled to accept that this simple act of generosity could carry any real meaning in a world so filled with brutality. They wore their new coats, yes, and they tried to embrace the warmth they offered, but there was a lingering sense of disbelief. Was this warmth, this unexpected kindness, just a fleeting moment in a war that had no room for such things? Was it an illusion, a trick of fate that would soon fade into nothingness? And yet, even as these doubts flickered in the back of their minds, they could not escape the fact that the coats had brought something they had not felt in a long time: hope. It was fragile, almost imperceptible at times, but it was there. And that small spark was enough to begin to shift something deep within them. For others, the coats represented something more immediate, more personal. They had been given a small piece of dignity, a small piece of the life they had lost. The war had taken so much from them, and for so long, they had been reduced to mere survivors, scraping by on whatever they could find, whatever scraps the world had left behind. The coats were a symbol of something else, a reminder that they were still human, still worthy of care, still deserving of warmth. For these families, the coats became something to hold on to, a tangible representation of the kindness that had arrived when they least expected it. The soldiers who had brought them had not come with weapons, they had come with something far more powerful, an act of kindness that, in that moment, had changed the very fabric of their world. But as the days turned into weeks, the coats also served as a mirror, reflecting something deeper about the human condition, something the people of the town had not been able to confront until now. As they wore the coats, they began to realize that the warmth they offered was not just a physical comfort. It was a challenge to the world they had been forced to accept, a challenge to the cold, uncaring forces that had shaped their lives for so long. The coats were not simply an external gift. They represented something much more profound, a moral reversal. For so long, the people had lived in a world where the strong imposed their will on the weak, where survival had become a daily struggle, and where kindness had been all but obliterated by the overwhelming forces of war. The coats were a quiet rebellion against that harsh reality. They were a statement, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people had the power to choose kindness, to choose humanity. The soldiers who had delivered the coats had not been forced to do so. They were not under any obligation, and there had been no grand plan behind the gesture. It was simply an act of compassion, one that had no ulterior motive and no strings attached. This was what made it so powerful, so unexpected. For the people of the town, it was a moment of reckoning. They had spent so much time thinking of the world in terms of enemies and allies, of occupiers and the occupied, of winners and losers. But the arrival of these soldiers had blurred those lines, challenged those divisions. They were not simply enemies. They were human beings, capable of acts of kindness, of compassion. And in that realization, something fundamental shifted within the people of the town. It was not the coats that had changed everything, but what they symbolized: a reversal of the old world, a world where kindness had been crushed underfoot, where survival had come at the expense of everything else. The moral reversal was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen in every home. But over time, as the coats were worn, as their warmth became a part of the daily routine, the people began to look at the world through a different lens. They began to see that even in the midst of war, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, there was still the possibility for something good. They had been living in a world that had told them they were nothing more than victims, that they were powerless in the face of overwhelming forces. But now, they began to understand that their humanity, their capacity for kindness, was not something that could be taken away. It was a force that could still be wielded, even in the darkest hours. And yet, even as the warmth of the coats began to seep into their hearts, there was still an underlying tension. The people could not ignore the fact that the soldiers who had brought them warmth had also been part of the greater machinery of war. They could not forget that the same forces that had brought them comfort had also brought them suffering. The coats, for all their warmth, could not erase the reality of the war. The soldiers who had brought them had left, and the occupation would continue. The occupiers were still there, still holding their grip on the town, still controlling the lives of its people. The coats had not changed that. They had not ended the war, nor had they stopped the suffering that was still to come. But what they had done was open a door to the possibility of a different world, a world where kindness, not cruelty, might be the prevailing force. It was a small hope, a fragile one, but it was enough to keep the people going, enough to remind them that no matter how cold the world became, there was always the possibility for warmth. And so, as the days wore on, the coats became more than just an item of clothing. They became a symbol of resistance, not in the traditional sense, but in a deeper, more profound way. The people of the town had not been conquered, they had not been broken. They had been given a gift, a reminder that in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was still light. It was a light that came not from the power of armies or the might of nations, but from the simple, unassuming power of human kindness. It was a light that could not be extinguished, no matter how fierce the storm, no matter how relentless the cold. And for the people of the town, it was the most precious gift they had ever received. It was the warmth of the human spirit, and it had changed everything. The arrival of the British soldiers and their unexpected gift had sown the seeds of something deep within the people of the town. At first, it had been a brief, almost imperceptible shift, a momentary flicker of hope that warmed their bodies against the harsh winter. The coats had been simple, practical, but they had represented far more than warmth. They symbolized a quiet defiance against the forces that had sought to strip away their dignity and humanity. For so long, the people had lived in a world where kindness seemed like a distant memory, where compassion had been smothered by the overwhelming weight of occupation and fear. Now, they stood at the cusp of something they had never dared to hope for, a reminder that, even in the most oppressive of times, the human spirit had not been completely crushed. But what had initially felt like a fleeting moment of relief soon began to evolve into something more complex, something that threatened to unravel the very fabric of the lives they had known. As the days passed, the initial gratitude that had accompanied the gift of the coats began to give way to a quiet, unsettling reflection. The warmth of the coats, though undeniable, could not erase the reality that the war was still there, still shaping their lives in ways both subtle and profound. The occupiers had not disappeared, the war had not ended. The soldiers who had brought them kindness were, in the end, still soldiers, part of the same machinery that had wreaked havoc on their lives. The coats, for all their symbolism, could not undo the suffering that had been caused by the war. They could not fill the empty spaces left by lost loved ones, nor could they heal the deep emotional scars that the people carried with them. The warmth that had momentarily thawed their bodies had not yet reached the deeper recesses of their hearts. The families, each in their own way, began to wrestle with this realization. The coats, at first a beacon of hope, had become a constant reminder of the moral reversal that had begun to take place. It was not just the soldiers' kindness that had affected them, but the realization that even those they had once regarded as enemies had the capacity for compassion. For the people of the town, this was a revelation, one that shook the foundation of everything they had believed to be true about the world. The world they had known had been divided into stark, rigid lines: the occupiers and the occupied, the oppressors and the oppressed. There was little room for nuance, little room for complexity. But now, as they wore the coats and felt the warmth seep into their bones, they began to question everything.